People of parliamentary privilege. You are privileged as members, obviously, and as witnesses to this inquiry, and no legal action can be taken in UK courts on any grounds arising from the fact that you have provided oral evidence here. However, and this is important to note, witnesses should always be prevented from using privilege as a cover for making irrelevant, inappropriate or malicious allegations. Clearly, I don't expect that of any of you, but I just feel it appropriate to remind everybody. And reporting of these proceedings enjoys qualified privilege, not absolute. On that basis, I think we are ready to start. So I don't know if the sound recording is... Yep, okay. Order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Foreign Affairs Committee and our inquiry into Russian corruption and the United Kingdom. There's clearly a lot to get through in a very short space of time, so forgive us, but questions will be directly targeted at one of the witnesses. If you feel you absolutely must add something on the back of somebody else's evidence, please let me know, and I'm sure we can. But as much as possible, if we can narrow it down so we don't have 4 people answering each question, that would be ideal. Pretty, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Chair. First question to Oliver. Can you give the committee a sense of the scale of, so-called dirty money being laundered through London?
Blimey. It's a tough one to begin with. I think I don't know how long we have, but just to look at the historical context of this, we've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
So this money is deeply embedded in our system and has been since at least the 1950s. In that regard, how much money is being laundered that's already been laundered, it becomes a bit of a tricky question. I think possibly the interesting thing to draw attention to is the Deutsche Bank analysis of the errors and omissions data from 2015, which is called dark money. They reckoned that at that stage the amount was accelerating. They were putting it at about £1 billion a month. That is on the low side compared to the National Crime Agency's estimate, which is £100 billion a year. But I would say that at a minimum of £1 billion a month, and I think 100 billion, obviously there's quite a lot of zeros at the end of 100 billion, which I think possibly alerts us to the fact that it's a guess.
And can you, just to build upon that point, where do you think, what assets has that hidden money basically gone into?
Well, I'd say the majority of it's going into property, just because if you've got that much money, there isn't that much you can spend it on. Obviously, luxury goods, art, yachts, and so on. A certain amount goes into private schooling. If you look at the nationality of children, foreign children attending British private schools, you can see that the top 3 are Hong Kong, China and Russia. Not in that order, China, Hong Kong, Russia actually, which obviously are 3 countries, 3 jurisdictions which have a bit of a dirty money problem. So it's possible to speculate that some of that may be dirty. Also, if you look at the nationality of people getting Tier 1 investor visas, you would see again the top 2 are China and Russia. Again, 2 countries with significant capital flight problems. So I suspect that it's possible to speculate that quite a lot of the money is also going into visas.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask, Tom, do you have a view in terms of how good, strong, moderate UK intelligences at actually understanding the relationship between Russian authorities, associates to Putin, and following the money that actually comes into London?
Not very, I suppose, is the simple answer. I think realistically, to build on what Oliver was saying, we've had the welcome mat out to money. It's been financial investment as opposed to industrial investment over the last 20 years. We've had a regulatory stance which has welcomed that money, and so of course it's not something I think that we've been particularly concerned about. So why would we consider it a security risk? And that I think is a question that we should debate this afternoon. But no, I don't think we have a genuinely good sense as to how all these connections work. It frankly comes down to the work revealed by things like the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers. That's where you start to see the links being revealed. I'm not sure if it weren't for the journalists who do that work, we'd have the picture we have today.
And do you think there is, what I'm interested in is really views, and I'll come to other members of the panel shortly on the same point as well, in terms of the intelligence services, the financial regulator, the serious fraud office. Do you think this is on their radar at all? And what kind of measures could be brought in, whether it's through law enforcement, changing the laws, but then actually looking at the steps that the government can effectively bring in?
So I guess I can't really comment on the intelligence service point, but certainly as regards to the FCA, the NCA, the SFO, the fundamental issue is a lack of funding. This is something that you cannot engage with unless you're prepared to spend considerable time and effort digging into numbers. So funding is lacking. I say we've had a light touch regulation approach, which means that money has come in, we have no idea really what money is crossing the border. I mean, I worked in investment banking for 20 years, and I don't mind saying that I look back on some of the deals that happened during that time and wonder, would we have done those deals today? So, you know, there are assets that have been listed on the London stock market over the past 20 years, which perhaps were, you know, London wanted to win that business as opposed to it going to New York or anywhere else, and London facilitated those transactions happening in London rather than somewhere else.
So do you think we've deliberately made ourselves attractive and open for that money to come to London compared to other financial centres?
I do. No, I do, and it's a different country, but if you look at the debate going on at the moment about where is Saudi Arabia going to list its Aramco business, people are talking about bending all sorts of rules in order to win that business. So that it continues, and it's not a one-off. This is something that has happened over the last 20 years, particularly in the kind of post-98 financial crisis period of 2008.
Thank you. Juliet, can I ask you for your views, particularly in terms of, you know, what steps, irrespective of resources, we've already heard from Tom that resourcing is an issue, what other practical steps could be taken? Bear in mind we know what the financial regulatory landscape looks like. We have organisations like the SFO, we have intelligence services, you know, all these conduits of information, perhaps how they could fuse that together to actually be more proactive.
Well, just taking a step back, I've worked on 3 of these big international money laundering investigations now for The Guardian. So I started with HSBC 3 or 4 years ago with their Swiss bank, and then Panama Papers and Paradise Papers. And we could see how other countries were responding when these big investigations were published by our partners in Germany and France and Sweden and places. And what was happening in those countries was prosecutions. You know, Shakira's recently received a multi-million-pound tax bill from the Spanish tax office. The chairman of Santander was brought to book over money that he had in HSBC Swiss Bank in France. They prosecuted in a very public way the heiress of the Nina Ricci fashion empire. In the UK, the resounding silence. There was one prosecution in the wake of the Panama Papers, but this was a chap who'd already lied to the tax authority, a minor property guy, no one had heard of him, and it was a slam dunk. So there's no... I agree with Tom that resource is an issue, but actually I think it comes down to political will. And I think it comes down to these agencies, and by that I mean the SFO, the NCA, and HMRC being given their head. They don't need to take down a lot of big scalps, but they need to do a few very public prosecutions once in a while. So in that sense, it's not so much a question of resource, it's a question of really permission. And it does concern me when I hear things like, you know, there's Theresa May's long-standing ambition to merge the SFO with the NCA. It creates a certain amount of insecurity. When the FCA was having a certain amount of success punishing banks for misbehaviour, during the financial crisis, Tom Wheatley, the head of the agency, was removed. And that sends a very, very powerful message. The message that we received after the Panama Papers at The Guardian, well, there were 2 initiatives, but the immediate response was demands here for us to hand over the data. And we received calls from the NCA. And at one point, our lawyer explained that the possibility of a raid by law enforcement was live. It never happened. But the reaction was similar this time. Now, what David Cameron did at the time, and I think it was a bold and kind of brave move, given that he was at the centre of the story with the Panama Papers, was to insist that the Crown dependencies made available within an hour of request information on who owns shell companies by implementing central registers of who owns these shell companies, of beneficial owners. Yeah. And that initiative was pursued, but I think it's now hit the sand, and I'm not sure actually that any of the overseas territories have made much change to the way that they're collecting the information. I stand to be corrected, but...
Can I just ask, just because you've raised, the sort of different strands where government can intervene and where investigations can take place, do you have a fixed view at all in terms of, where the authority should sit, the responsible organisation or department?
I think it sort of depends whether it's crime or whether it's sanctions, whether it's tax avoidance, evasion. And I know that at HMRC, for example, the average tax investigation can take 3 years. It's an awful long time. CPS has had cases going for 6 or 7 years. So I think it just depends.
Can I move on, Bob? You were going to...
You talked about security risk, and I just want to put this to, isn't it the case that actually there isn't so much a security risk with this? There could be soft corruption, agents of influence. There's sort of a certain amount of peddling, up the banks and the upmarket property companies. But actually, the issue is that the Russians are going to be are attacking us and undermining us in other areas, and they're reliant on a certain sort of greedy self-interest to allow this to happen, be it destabilising the Baltic or the Balkans or anywhere else. But they're allowing a sort of greedy self-interest that they'll assume that we'll keep processing their dodgy money and their dodgy oligarchs or their oligarchs in general here, whilst they conduct this cold conflict elsewhere in Europe. So they're trying to almost separate this financial element from all the other things that they're doing. Is that fair, or do you think that's wrong?
Possibly. I think the thing that I would point to is that in 2013 and again in the SDSR in 2015, the whole issue of serious and organised crime, money laundering, etc., was made a national security threat. The question I would pose is, are we treating it as a national security threat? That the government itself has said it's a national security threat. I haven't had a chance to read the National Security Capability Review, which came out at 2:10, but I see from the press that, again, organised crime and corrupt elites are going to be a feature of that. If it's a national security threat, then let's treat it as one.
Do you think it is one, and in what way is it a national security threat?
I don't think it's a national security threat. I frankly wouldn't have put it as a tier 2 national security threat in the way that it's been positioned there. I think there are ways that we can treat this issue without having to run around and be sort of concerned about security. But we've left the door open for 20 years, and so to my mind, if we're going to deal with the issue which is in front of us, we're going to have to ramp up the way we treat it. If that means we have to call it a national security threat to get the necessary resources in place, then that's what we're going to have to do.
Okay, but what is the threat? And that's what I want to know. Is the threat that it buys corruption in this country? Is the threat that it's just unhealthy, it's bad for the system? What's the threat?
I think that yes, it is. It's unhealthy. It's bad for the threat. Who knows why what happened in my hometown of Salisbury happened. But the fact of the matter is that there is an agglomeration of Russian money in the UK, and with that comes people and activity which I'm not sure we want to have here.
Thank you.
Bob, you were going to ask about...
Karl Kolakowski said that there are approximately, he named 100 sort of significant beneficiaries around the regime of President Putin. Bill Browder has said there's 1,000 to 2,000 people who are the big beneficiaries around the Putin entourage. Do we have any numbers of people around the Putin entourage that UK law enforcement agencies should be looking at? I suspect can we address this question to Luke and then anyone else like Oliver who particularly wants to maybe contribute afterwards?
Yeah, well, I think what we have to understand is the big picture, which is that there is, to go back to your earlier question also, that there's a sort of noisy public project in Russia, which is to influence other people's elections, to chew up European borders, and it's sort of based on a very ultra-nationalist conservative philosophy at home, but there's also a kind of private project involving the 100+ people that Bill Browder talked about, which is essentially to steal as much money as you can in Russia and to offshore it, because actually none of the Russian elite have got any great confidence in the future, or indeed in Vladimir Putin. His regime is more precarious than it seems, and they are terrified about losing their wealth and also about sort of predatory attack from inside. So that wealth is offshored, it's in London, it's in other places, and the point is that Putin can kind of instrumentalize it. So if you're an oligarch, it's not like being an English or a UK businessman. It means that if the phone rings and the Kremlin asks you to do something, you have to kind of deploy that money, whether it's a football stadium, whether it's active measures across Europe or support for a far-right political party and so on. So there's this kind of interplay between people who look like businessmen but are actually, I would say, kind of informal state functionaries. And these are people, of course, we're familiar with their names, and many of them have got substantial assets in this country.
And this is for that sort of shadow vertical of power, but it's you have been talking about the shadow vertical inside Ukraine, inside Russia. You've got the shadow vertical outside, which is the oligarchs and their bank accounts, and then they do the servicing of the Kremlin, of the Russian state, with the cash that they've got, and part of that cash is to be spent at Putin's. President Putin's
yeah, I wrote I've done a couple of books on Russia. One of them was sort of mafia state, and I think that when you're thinking about it, it's much easier if you get away from the idea that this is a kind of classical sovereign entity. It isn't. It's essentially a kind of quasi-criminal syndicate where Putin is at the top. He has people around him, oligarchs, other Kremlin officials, all of whom, by the way, are multi-billionaires, and many of whom are not Steve Jobs, but happen to know him from judo club in St. Petersburg 25 years ago. And they are a sort of team. And we can talk or not talk about Putin's wealth, but it's clear that whether or not he formally owns this money, which I would say is somewhere between $200 and $300 billion, he can use it for political projects, for personal projects, and for domestic projects.
And have we got a list of those names of those people around him? Are people reluctant to say that who those oligarchs are, or can we start naming those people here?
Well, I mean, very many of them have already featured on a list by the US Treasury and were sanctioned after sort of 2014 and have been sanctioned by the UK. I mean, I think this is a sort of question for the committee is whether you want to expand that list. And I think one very effective measure, for example, would be to, if you were to draw up a list of the top 5,000 officials in the Kremlin and to say that they are on some kind of stop list for coming to the UK, plus their children as well, and they're not welcome here, I think that would be hugely effective because it wouldn't damage the Russian people, but it would damage the people at the top.
How many of them are in the UK, or travel frequently to the UK, or whose children are in the UK?
A huge number, a very large proportion. It's an extremely attractive destination. There's a sort of cohesive group of Russian speakers who are here. And it goes to my point about kind of official pessimism in the Putin regime. Actually, the kids are here, which in some ways is consoling because there's not, I don't think, going to be any kind of military conflict involving the UK and Russia. But in other ways, there is a view that actually the UK, that basically we're suckers, and that you can take advantage of all of the freedoms and legal protections you have here while stealing at home. So you steal in a place of legal nihilism and you offshore in a place of legal solidity.
So forgive me for cutting to the chase. It sounds like you're saying that actually the UK government does have an awful lot of influence on the Putin regime through the actions of permitting people to enter or leave the country and permitting people to keep or not keep their wealth here.
We have, I would say, more leverage than any other European Union nation because Russians come here, like to come here. Many of them decent, by the way. They're not all criminals and crooks. And were we to kind of shut that off, then what is the point in having billions if you can no longer go to London or New York or Courchevel or Vienna?
Ian, you wanted to come in quickly.
Let's take an example of this. Igor Shovlov, the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, is supposed to earn £112,000 a year, but is reported to have bought 2 flats within a few hundred yards of here worth $11.4 million. Now, what do you think our government or the British authorities, what sort of action should be taken in relation to cases like that?
Well, I mean, I talk sort of generally. I mean, it's tricky because Shuvalov is Deputy Prime Minister, so presumably he has some kind of official status. But this is just one sort of egregious example of what happens all the time. It's not just him. There are senators and former senators buying palaces in Hampstead. There are others who buy flats in Knightsbridge and Mayfair for their kids. A lot of this is done through people at arm's length. So it's the chauffeur, it's the former school friend, and so on. And it just goes back to my original point that because Russia is so precarious, if you're at the top of the system, anybody can fall into the mincer, and therefore you want to get your assets out. And London, I would say, is the most attractive place to do that.
Surely the best way to put pressure on Putin is to go after the people around him, like Shovlov and other senior officials.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the only sensible method is to go after the money of the people around Putin, because actually what everyone recognises inside Russia, in the elite, is this is, to some extent, Putin's money as well.
Could I ask witnesses, when we talk to ministers about this, I mean, we questioned the Foreign Secretary about this last week, and he claims, it's a law enforcement issue, the law enforcement agencies have got the powers that are necessary, politicians can't intervene, we can't tell them what to do, and all of that. Do you think that the law enforcement agencies have the tools they need to tackle this? Or do you think that, I can see Juliet is chomping
I think they do
at the
have
bit?
the tools. I just don't think they have the political backing.
Sorry?
I think they do have the tools. I just don't think they have the political backing to do it. I think all the side. I think they're discouraged from doing it.
Actively discouraged?
If you look at donations to the Conservative Party, a lot of Russian money coming in that way. But I think generally, in terms of the interests of the city, the engine of our economy, shutting off the Russian money tap is not in the city's interest, and those arguments hold sway. But then I think we have to take a decision. If we're not going to have enforcement, if we're going to, then we have to have transparency. And at the moment, we have neither. So if you buy a multi-million-pound home in Onslow Square, you buy it with an offshore company, and the land registry, all it will show is the name of that offshore company, and then you're relying on a leak from the Panama Papers to tell you who's behind that offshore company. So we've got legislation coming in which should hopefully deal with that, and we want it to come as soon as possible. But you can't have lots of shell companies that don't declare their beneficial owners in British jurisdictions. And at the moment there's no pressure, there's no sign that that's about to change. So I think we either need enforcement or we need transparency, but we cannot have neither, because that just means we're open for all this money.
Mike, do you want to come in quickly on this?
I wanted to go on to the questions that was legal.
Did you want to come on this very point?
Yes, there's two bits that I don't understand about the asset business. One is when some of us went on a tour of a lot of these properties last week, we were being repeatedly told that such and such a house was bought for £26 million when it was only really worth £6 million. Can somebody explain to me why anybody would do that?
Oliver, you were there.
Why would... Well, I understand. I'm not myself, sadly, a high-ranking money launderer, but I understand that if your asset has an inflated price, you can then raise quite a lot of money from a bank on the back of it. And therefore, if your asset is worth £26 million, you can then take out a loan for however much it is, and you therefore have essentially laundered your money. I mean, I understand from the indictment against... some of the indictments that Bob Mueller has brought in, this is exactly one of the ways that Ukrainian money was brought into the United States, by essentially inflating the value of property.
So in essence, you're laundering it because it's now...
It's now a loan from a bank PLC, and not, money that you've been given in brown envelope by...
And you might have been paying a third party who was sympathetic to you anyway?
Yeah, I just on the point of shell companies. Shell companies are a very big problem, and the sooner we have a register of offshore ownership, the better. But full credit to David Cameron's government to bring in a number of initiatives to help an element of transparency in the UK. But essentially, Companies House, which now obliges British companies and structures to report the person of significant control, that doesn't check that information. I've been doing an article recently about a tax haven in the Caribbean, Nevis, which is the smaller half of St Kitts and Nevis, and that is a secrecy jurisdiction. And they like to own quite a lot of British LLPs via two Nevis structures. And you can see that the same two Nevis structures will own, in one case which I was looking at, there's two companies called Torberg and Uniwell, which are both registered in the same place in Nevis. They're involved in what's called the Russian laundromat, if you've heard of that, which the OCCRP revealed. There are 372 LLPs controlled by these same two Nevis companies. All of them declare a different person of significant control, even though they're owned by the same two companies, and that's algebraically impossible. And yet Companies House isn't checking that. They should have at least a system that could say, hang on a second, Mr. Nevis International Trust Company, that can't actually be right. But no one's checking this information. So it's not just offshore companies that are the problem. Companies House is a real problem as well. The information that is being provided to Companies House needs to be checked, or at the very least, notarized or certified by a regulated professional in the UK.
And the trusts, and the trusts, the beneficial ownership of trusts register now exists, but it's only available, if I'm right in saying that it's only available to law enforcement agencies and not to the public. Isn't one of the things that we've learned from the last 3 years, partly thanks to journalists, that actually the public being able to examine some of these things provides a much better disinfectant than the law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, I'm significantly more nerdy about this than most law enforcement professionals. I think they have more time pressures. I like to spend an evening surfing the Companies House website. That's just the kind of person I am. I'm slightly embarrassed to admit it. I suspect that law enforcement professionals have got better things to do.
And can I just ask, because this is the system is one that has existed in this country for 200 years in some element or other, perhaps without the offshoring, but it's what the British aristocracy have used for centuries, isn't it? Is that why we're not tackling it?
Well, the system of trusts?
Yes.
But, I mean, trusts, I think, are a relatively minor problem compared to companies, or certainly a harder problem to solve. I mean, there's 3.5 million UK companies. There's an extra 500,000 created every year. This is a live issue, and it's really taken off in the last few years. It would be... I mean, it doesn't do it... I mean, there's essentially a belief in sort of, I think partly because of World Bank's doing business rating, that the easier it is to create a company, the better. So when you see those signs saying Britain is a great place to do business on buses, one of the measures that they rate that by is how easy it is to create a company. It isn't actually, if it takes you a day to create a company instead of 13 minutes, it doesn't really make any substantive difference. It's nonsense, but that's what the World Bank says, so that's what we go on.
Mike, you want to come?
I think Juliet probably would be the right person to start answering this. It's been, you mentioned, Oliver's mentioned Nevis. What are the main entry points or intermediary countries that are used as the source of Russian money coming in to London?
Well, the BVI is very popular.
British Virgin Islands.
That's it. And in Russia, actually, I think one of the names for shell company, one of the words people use is they just call them BVIs, a shorthand. Whether they're registered in St Kitts or in the British Virgin Islands. But we've also noticed slightly more sophisticated setups recently in the Isle of Man. So what we can see there is that certain corporate service providers have a very large number of Russian clients, and corporate service providers, they do what Mossack Fonseca used to do. They incorporate a shell company and they offer their staff to act as pretend directors and pretend shareholders of these companies, so that real directors and shareholders can be hidden. And we were looking in particular at private jets in the Isle of Man.
The Lewis Hamilton case.
The Lewis Hamilton case.
Yeah.
He kind of was the exception, because most people, I think, the list that we had, because of our league, had about 50 jets on it. And most of the names were Russian or Russian Federation, Ukraine, etc. So not only were they getting a very generous tax break from the British government in terms of the VAT that would normally be due on a $60 million private jet, but they were getting a certificate that allowed them to fly in and out of European airports unquestioned by customs and undisturbed. And we've exposed what we think are failings in enforcement there, just in this one little case with these jets. But the inquiry on that seems to have run into the sand. So I think there's something that could be done right now in the Isle of Man, just on private jets. But certainly the Isle of Man seems to have been a particular favourite.
What is the role, you mentioned British Virgin Islands, what's the role specifically of British Overseas Territories?
So they, in a sense, we outsource the checking to them. Within these territories, there is information about who the real owners of companies are. It's not necessarily visible centrally at government level, but within the companies like Mossack Fonseca that provide that service, it should be visible. The truth is, even those intermediaries aren't often aware of whose companies they are, and those entities can then open a company in the UK, become its shareholder, and that UK company, because it's registered here, can open a bank account. And that's the key. That's how you get the money in.
And it's also been reported that there is a Russian involvement in money going through Cyprus. How important is that?
Well, perhaps you'd like to...
Oliver.
Cyprus and Latvia. I mean, Latvia, as I understand, is belatedly beginning to clean itself up. all the Baltic states to a certain extent. Latvia was always the biggest in terms of the amount of money coming in, and Cyprus. That part of the problem is, as I understand it, and Tom probably knows this better than me, that once money is inside the Eurozone, it is not part of the SWIFT system. They have their own system, and because of they have significant privacy concerns, and therefore it's much harder for the FBI to trace it, and the FBI tends to be the only people with any interest in actually prosecuting any of this stuff. So it becomes difficult. I mean, just on that point, again, there's two different kinds of jurisdiction involved. You've got the secrecy jurisdictions who hide the ownership, and that's the Seychelles, Nevis. The BVI previously, though the number of new companies there has fallen quite sharply in the last few years, I think probably because of Juliet. And then the countries that have the bank accounts, of which Latvia and Cyprus are the two most important.
What about the role of people who get hold of EU passports, EU citizenship, and come in that way? I know that applies in Cyprus. It's also been reported that Malta has some role. Is that a general issue as well?
Well, I mean, they are checked. I mean, there is a degree of due diligence. I would, to be honest, I would say that their programs, though there are definite questions to be asked, and a number of high-profile Russian oligarchs. I mean, recently Oleg Deripaska was reported to have received a Cypriot passport. I would say there were considerably more questions over the Caribbean schemes, particularly Dominica and St Kitts, which have been much. The numbers have been very large, and the checks have been very minimal for a long time.
Thank you.
Tom.
And Andrew, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, on the issue of the crown dependencies and the overseas territories, we're talking about places that are not part of the United Kingdom, so they're not subjected to laws made in this place. They make their own laws. What laws and what regulations do you feel that they're not implementing to try to deal with some of these issues compared to what we in the United Kingdom do? Are they doing less than what we do?
Yeah, I mean, the key one is registering who owns the shell companies. It's the registers of beneficial owners and making them public.
But do we do that here? Is everything completely public here?
We've been trying.
But do we do it here at the moment?
And yes, we do.
We
do. So Companies House, it became mandatory from starting in April 2016 to declare which human was behind the share ownership, who was the majority shareholder in a company. Now that system is imperfect. I was looking at a trust in New Zealand that belongs to the ruling family of a very nasty dictatorship, and I had a look in Companies House, and it appears in the register of what's meant to be the humans who own the company. There's no human declared, just the trust. So it's not working. It's not working in every case. But what are they doing that we're not? There's the issue of transparency and just simply checking where the money's coming from.
But do you see the issues that these small places face? Because clearly financial services is a big income for them, and clearly they are British, and therefore ultimately they should abide by international law, and they should meet certain international standards. Absolutely agree with that. But if you take away their ability to bring an income in, because they are separate jurisdictions, they can do that. They can have lower taxes. They can have lower rates in that sense. But if you take it to an extent that you actually prevent them from being able to be self-sustainable, isn't that something we need to take into account? So there needs to be a balance here.
In the sense that we're sort of beholden to support them financially as well as legally,
that's what would happen
as offering.
We would finish up having to
protection from our military, etc. Yeah, I mean, at the moment, though, we've looked at the figures with experts, and we think the UK is effectively through the VAT system subsidising the island to be a tax haven. Well, that should stop straight away. And the UK has in the past imposed its will. So the Crown dependencies and Oliver's written about this, were put in a terrible financial pickle around 2008 when Europe insisted, we had a Labour government at the time, that they stopped taxing offshore companies and domestic companies differently. So either everyone had to pay 20% tax, which is what the domestic companies were paying, or everyone had to pay zero, or they all had to pay something in between. And they opted for everyone to pay zero. So overnight, they lost all their domestic tax revenue. So it means that, if they then lose their financial revenue, they're in trouble. There will be an issue.
And just one final really quick, sorry.
Can I just pick up on that, which is that actually the decision might end up being taken out of our hands. So Brussels is now publishing lists of high-risk jurisdictions. I'm going to sound like an apologist for the banking sector, but when you see those names appearing, as a banker, you're going to say, well, why are we dealing with a transaction that involves these countries? So we may well find that actually someone else is going to force them to change if they want to, or change their business model if they want to continue. And I think we need to also bear in mind that there's a difference between secrecy and privacy, and I think often people mix that up. I don't think many people want their financial dealings open to scrutiny necessarily, but there should be a possibility to scrutinise them, and I think that needs to also be considered.
Just very quickly, sorry, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to say briefly, they're not all as bad as each other. I'd say Jersey's actually, these days, quite good. It's actually got probably almost a better record of returning assets than the UK does. Anguilla, however, is pretty bad.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's
variations.
I mean, Jersey, Gibraltar's bad, BVI, Anguilla. So.
Okay. And just very finally, do you feel that the overseas territories and crown dependencies that have financial service sector, do you feel that their governments are trying to resolve these issues, are cooperating, or do you feel there's any that are just trying to avoid having to deal with the issue?
I haven't seen any evidence that the business model, any evidence of political pressure within any of these jurisdictions to change the business model, to be honest. I think it will have to come from the UK, and that's a very difficult thing to impose. But the UK has imposed it before, when I mentioned the 2008 change. And it can be done again if we consider it important enough. I mean, I think it is potentially extremely important, isn't it, to stop dark money being funneled into the UK. You were explaining about the history of how Russian money came to be here in the first place. And I wonder if you might say that again.
Well, I don't know if there's time for all that. I mean, I think there is a strong historical case for the fact that essentially the seed capital for the post-war rebirth of the City of London came from the Soviet Union. It was money from the Soviet Union that they didn't wish to keep in American banks. Dollars they wanted to keep somewhere else. And that became the basis of the euro-dollar market, which essentially then gave birth to post-war London's prosperity. So, I mean, it is the roots for connections between Moscow and City of London go back a very long way. This isn't an entirely post-Soviet thing. I mean, the bank of the Soviet Central Bank used to keep or had offshore structures in Jersey, which it used to disguise money that it for make payments for the Communist Party. So that they were aware of our vulnerabilities pre-1991. This isn't, they've exploited them more greater since, but this isn't a new thing.
Ian, you wanted to comment? Yeah. That the FCA had a limited success, and obviously they have a statutory role to require regulated firms to go through that enhanced due diligence process. So has the system broken down, or is it the case that the laws are strict enough but they're just not being applied properly?
I'm not a great expert on this area, so I might have to demur, but I don't think that it's entirely broken down. I think that there is genuine supervision. I just think that when it comes to tackling big cases, taking down high-profile perpetrators, that there isn't the political courage and support. There isn't the political support and the kind of courage among the regulators to necessarily do that. I think they have been discouraged. I mean, I was just reporting on a Maltese bank recently which had tried to passport its licence to the UK so it could open accounts here for British residents. The head of that bank's just been indicted for money laundering by the FBI, and the bank's in shutdown. But the FCA actually did confirm that they had refused a licence to this bank on the grounds of that they had concerns about it. So the system does work to a certain extent.
Can I just add one thing on that? Is that the supervisory landscape in the UK is highly, highly fragmented. There are 20-odd supervisors. It's not just the FCA. There's HMRC. There is the separate ones for the legal society, for the legal industry, for the accounting industry. Some of those are professional bodies, so they're not statutory. So we have a highly, highly fragmented supervisory landscape. There is this new animal called OPBAS at the FCA, which is meant to be the supervisor of supervisors, which should hopefully raise standards across the board. But we're in 2018, and this issue has been going on for many, many years. So the fragmentation of the supervisory landscape is something that actually probably has hurt us, because not everything sits with the FCA if you believe the FCA is the most effective regulator.
Pretty, you want to go briefly?
Tom, I just want to come back to you on that, because you mentioned off-BAS, the dynamic landscape that we have obviously here. Who do you think should be the penholder on, driving this forward? And also, is this a case of having better data or more rigorous oversight when it comes to following the money? Because ultimately, this is what we're speaking about. We are trying to follow the money and identify, the roots behind that money, but also looking at the high-risk situation, seeing if the due diligence is being undertaken by the FCA, making sure that, London isn't just being used to launder other people's money, and, trying to preserve our reputation as well for the City of London.
So the question that I've been asked for quite a while is, where does the buck stop on all of this? And again, I find it striking that only within the last 6 months is there now a minister whose title includes economic crime, security and economic crime. So we appear to have woken up that somebody needs to be responsible for that. But fundamentally, partly picking up on what Juliet says, we don't really understand the landscape here. So we're quite good at what the NCA might call drugs and thugs and cash in the car park, right? That we're not bad at. But what they call high-end money laundering, I mean, with the best will in the world, your average NCA officer is not going to understand the kinds of structures that we used to put together at JP Morgan, right? That's simple as that. And I've sat in rooms with lawyers and accountants explaining what they do, and law enforcement are very honest. They say, "Can you explain that again? We don't understand." So there is the capability. I think the second thing is that we're basically flying blind. So in this country, the data we have to determine financial crime is based on the suspicious activity reports regime, which is discussed extensively, how behind the door that is. We don't have any other information. Take Australia as an example. They record every financial transaction that crosses their border. They record every financial transaction that is more than 10,000 Australian dollars, I think. They have a huge amount of data that they can use and understand where a cash flow is coming from and so on. So that, for me, is something that we should be considering, because at the moment we have no situational awareness at all. And until we understand where we are, well, you can't figure out where you're trying to go.
And can I just ask on this, just to sort of not so much press the point, but if we don't have the information, the data, we're not able to really trace the flows. We have obviously a lot of, UK's role as taking refuge for international capital is pretty well known, and that's what we're discussing. But obviously the overall economic impact and what that does to our economy in certain sectors such as property, surely we do have data on there, and that's where the government can actually leverage that data to come up with better insights in terms of how we rebalance or tackle the situation. Yeah, so I think there are snapshots that we have, and often those snapshots again are produced by NGOs and journalists. So I think we have snapshots, but I certainly don't see an overall strategic assessment where we are and where we want to go. Okay, thank you.
Ian, you wanted to come back in? Sorry.
Tom, you talked about supervisory fragmentation, which I think is something that we all struggle to get our heads around with all the different bodies. We're just about to get another one, of course, the beneficial ownership registration system, which you've touched on already. What do you think needs to be in that for it to be effective?
I have to say I haven't looked at that. I think what we face at the moment, and this is what OPBAS is trying to address, is inconsistency between these different bodies. And so what we need to set is a baseline of expectation around supervision, and then we need to enforce that. And this is what OPBAS is meant to do. But fundamentally, it comes down to transparency, an ability to find the necessary information in order to conduct investigations, and just operate in an environment where information is available to those who are trying to police it. I think part of the problem at the moment is that it's not.
And that's your point, Oliver, isn't it? That this beneficial ownership registration system might work, but you would have to make sure it was checked properly.
I think that the suspicious activity report system is a major black hole. But you can see, I think, from it, by looking at the numbers, where the problems are. I mean, the banks, the overwhelming majority the SARs come from the financial sector. I think the banks are actually doing a pretty good job. But if you look at, say, company formation agents, trust and company formation agents, the number of SARs they filed is in 3 figures, I think. I mean, I've got more suspicious Nevis companies on my list right here than there are SARs reported last year. High-value dealers, estate agents, these aren't regulated sectors. So, I mean, there is no regulation of company formation agents. Anyone could become a company formation agent. So how do you check? How do you strike them off? These are, I did an article about 29 Harley Street, which is a company formation agent called Formations House. And it's like a fraud factory in the centre of London. There was just fraud after fraud after, insane frauds, Ocean 11's type fraud. And yet nothing apparently, it's still operating, nothing's been done, nothing happened since the article came out. And this is, there are so many sort of giant gaping gaps in the sort of regulatory architecture. And meanwhile, we're piling all the stuff on the banks and saying that they need to sort more stuff out. It's very inconsistent with what's happening.
This is a depressing theme that we come up time and time again, is the abuse of British corporate structures. Oliver mentioned Harley Street, the Russian laundromat case, which involved $20 billion of dirty Russian money, about 740 million of which was processed by UK high street banks, was flowing through kind of hub companies properly registered at Companies House. And there was just, I'll give you one example. There was one company called Seaborn Limited, which reported SEABON Limited, it's just around the corner in Tooley Street, reported profits of £1 in 2013, and we found $9 billion going through it, and nobody noticed.
Just to show that everything's connected, Tooley Street was also where the Ukrainian oligarch Yuri Ivanushenko controlled Europe's biggest retailer of knockoff designer goods. Was also registered on Tooley Street.
Sorry, can I come back?
The owner of Europe's biggest retailer of knockoff designer goods, a market in Odessa, was also registered at the same place on Tooley Street.
Knocked off designer goods?
Yeah, fake Prada.
Just to bring back just a straight question then. We're focusing on Russian corruption, clearly, because of the recent incidents, the incidents over the past decade and the corruption that is spreading into the UK. May I ask a slightly more general question then, and perhaps Tom, I think you might be the best person to answer this, but maybe Oliver, you might have some views. How much money are we talking about in terms of fraudulent money from Russia? And the second one is closing these loopholes will presumably have effects other than in Russia. Are there other countries that will be significantly affected?
There's a quote from the former Prime Minister that I like to refer to, which is that the UK has a history of benefiting from regulations elsewhere. And so we have chosen to create these loopholes, and so those loopholes will be used by anybody and everybody that wants to, for good or bad reason, for push or for pull, move money away from offshore. So whether that's China, whether that's Nigeria, whether that's Pakistan, whether that's, the list is endless. And I think what we find very difficult with the current situation is to determine what money is welcome and what money isn't, because actually all money appears to be welcome. So the challenge that we face is we need to build the wall higher in such a way as to, if you like, stop money coming into the country, or at least know what money is coming into the country and stop money coming into the country that is illicit or should not be here. I think the difficult question to ask is, to what extent can we pump out from behind that wall money that has arrived and which perhaps in hindsight shouldn't be here? And I think we have to be honest with ourselves and say, over the last 20 years, hundreds of billions, the NCA talks about hundreds of billions or whatever, the numbers are, as Oliver said, the more zeros, the more of a guess it is. But a lot of money has come into the UK, and the fact of the matter is that's in the system, it's been invested, and we're simply not going to uncover it.
So maybe, sorry, forgive me, Oliver, the follow-on in that case is this fundamentally the key to Britain's foreign policy for the last 100 years, is effectively as a haven for offshore assets?
I would certainly say that there was an element of calculation that Russian money was sort of almost a price worth paying after the murder in 2006 of Alexander Litvinenko. And I think, maybe this seems kind of indelicate, but we know that the government in about 2010 took the view that international relations were perhaps more important than responding very strongly to what happened in the Litvinenko case. And I think in part our failure to act then, both on Russian money and by doing stronger diplomatic sanctions, explains what happened in Salisbury 3 weeks ago.
I think you can add to that just the sort of the financial equivalence. I mean, the UKOS case was famously the confiscation of the UKOS oil company. The original privatisation of UKOS was questionable. The confiscation of it was even more questionable. Rosneft, the main beneficiary of that, then floated on the London Stock Exchange. You know, that's sort of the financial equivalent of ignoring Litvinenko. It's sort of
Mike.
What you referred earlier to this Deutsche Bank reports. In that it says that the UK's received £130 billion of hidden capital inflows, and the good chunk of it relates to Russia. Could you estimate how much that would be?
I think in that report it says that if you compare the amount coming in, or showing up in the UK's errors and emissions level with the capital outflows recorded by the Bank of Russia, it would look like Russia made up under half of it. But by the time the report was published, it was the rate had accelerated to about £1 billion a month. So of which it's saying about under half was Russia.
And if we start cracking down on this, presumably some of this money would then go out of the economy. What's the impact going to be on the British economy of such a withdrawal? Would that affect the exchange rate? Because the Deutsche Bank claim that these movements have a particular impact on currency rates.
I think it said it was marginally supportive of the exchange rate. So I don't think it. I mean, I think it would definitely have an impact at the top end of the property market. Whether
Which
you
would
think
be a
that's
good
bad
thing,
or a good thing
mean
is,
that people in this country could afford to buy properties.
I mean, we saw where this money was spent through our Panama Papers and laundromat investigations, and it goes on top end property, as Oliver says. It goes on private school fees. It goes on jewels. It goes on lawyers and sixth form colleges for kids who flunk their exams. But I think maybe this is a price worth paying.
I'm not arguing. I'm just trying to get a sense of what the impact would be.
Yes, there are other things going on that will have a greater impact on the foreign exchange rate than Russian money.
Yeah.
We're not that committee. Chris, you wanted to come in?
Wealth orders. I want to come on to in just 1 minute, but can I just check? Do you believe that President Putin himself has any assets in the United Kingdom?
I agree with you. I'm not sure that saying President Putin has assets is a meaningful question, because I think essentially rather in the way that aristocrats in the Middle Ages held property sort of at the pleasure of the king, oligarchs hold property at the pleasure of Mr. Putin. They get to own it and enjoy it in return for the fact that he gets whatever he wants whenever he wants.
It's a system which marries modern kleptocracy with what I would call kind of neo-feudalism. So it's a sort of feudal court with Putin as king, and he can modern kleptocracy, neo-feudalism, and he can dispose or take away.
So any improved oligarch is effectively part of this neo-feudal system.
And I think that's a key point that needs to be understood, is that, I mean, how many oligarchs have condemned what happened in Salisbury? I think the answer is none, even though they have substantial assets here.
Does that mean that any businessman who has money in Russia, any businessman at all who has money in Russia, is in some way part of the Putin regime?
I mean, it depends on the level, but I think the famous ones whom we know about, who feature in Forbes magazine, who have assets here, football clubs, houses, and so on. Of course, they're part of the regime. I mean, some of them are kind of open apologists for Putin. Others try and keep a kind of lower profile. But it is not possible to not. It's a sort of bounded political space, if that makes sense. And we also see these same oligarchs featuring in the investigation by Robert Mueller, the special counsel, into alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, acting as intermediaries. They intermediate, and they're used also for reasons of plausible deniability.
So, Deripaska, Abramovich, their money in the end is corrupt.
Well, I would say that their money exists at the pleasure of Vladimir Putin. Now, I think their lawyers would make a very robust case to say that they are extremely talented entrepreneurs who've made their money fairly, but everybody knows by looking at what happens to Mikhail Khodorkovsky that you can go from being the richest man in Russia to being in the Siberian prison cell should you transgress the kind of Kremlin code, which is that you don't interfere in politics, and you certainly don't mount any kind of meaningful challenge against Russia's kind of eternal president.
And can I just check, then, because we talk about kleptocracy, obviously meaning theft, and I understand that at every different level of the Russian Federation, if you get stopped by a police officer, as often as not, you have to pay a fine just to be able to carry on the rest of the day. If you want to sell British whiskey in a bar in Russia, you end up having to pay the local police and some official and some senior official. If you want a big contract for an element of the Sochi Games or whatever, then you have to salt away money here, there, and everywhere. I understand that element. You're all nodding, so you're just agreeing to that, I think. But there might be other forms of dirty money which would relate to controlling drugs, cartels, and gun running. Is that an element of this?
I mean, it can be, insofar as we know from leaked US State Department cables, which leaked in 2010, that certainly the view of the State Department is that there is a sort of close relationship between the state bureaucracy and organised crime. Hence Mafia State, which of course, ironically enough, was the thesis of Alexander Litvinenko and what he was due to testify about in the Spanish court when he was poisoned. And the role of organised crime is first of all, it's about money, but also it's sometimes to perform functions that the state doesn't want to acknowledge that it's doing. So you contract it out, almost like kind of outside contraction.
But if all of that is true, then the sort of blood that is associated with all of that, normally in other jurisdictions than ours, and therefore in places where it is, we don't touch through our legal entities and prosecuting authorities, is sort of washed away when it comes to the UK, and the money seems polite and nice, and lawyers, British lawyers, big legal firms are happy to deal with it, big accountancy firms are happy to deal with it, but in the end, it's blood money,
I mean, it's always difficult to make a fortune cleanly, but in contemporary Russia, it's impossible to if your assets exceed 50, 100 million, it's not possible to do that in a clean way because of the predatory nature of the state and the bureaucracy and the trade-offs you have to make with power to accumulate that wealth, but more to the point, to hang on to that wealth.
Can we move
Oliver, I still haven't done the unexplained wealth.
I would just say on your previous point with regard to drug trafficking, I would draw your attention to the report on the Kremlin insider Viktor Ivanov, which Alexander Litvinenko made shortly before his death, and which may or may not have been the reason why he was killed. I think it's very
and so do you think the unexplained wealth orders process is going to work? Is that going to have political will behind it?
I think it's potentially very helpful. I think it's a very powerful new tool. I'd be interested to see how the judges react to it because it's so powerful. Of course, I think what's important is that it's only a civil proceedings, and the evidence that's raised cannot then subsequently be used in a criminal proceeding.
Yeah.
So it would be helpful in terms of confiscating property which was illegally acquired in this country, but not in terms of putting these people in prison, which it depends what we want to do.
Right. Are you going to be very brief?
Yeah, because I think this is sort of slightly rounding up everything that we've just had. Probably start with Juliet, and maybe stick with Juliet unless anything is pressing. We have heard lots of sort of complicated descriptions of all the various different frauds and the way that corrupt Russian money and money from elsewhere comes in. Is there somewhere, some organisation like Transparency International or some other NGO, they've done a guide that you all agree, if you do this, this is the way to really clean up your system, or is there a bit here and a bit there and a bit elsewhere? Where is this standard, this is what you should do?
Well, you might want to instead look at countries which have, good, strong economies, but don't launder a lot of money. I mean, if you look at Sweden, for example, where everyone from the Prime Minister down publishes their tax returns, or Norway, which put aside a lot of money from oil into a sovereign wealth fund. We could have done that with our gas fields several decades ago. I think what you want perhaps to do is to look at countries elsewhere. I mean, Australia has a very active tax office, for example. They're now leading international collaborations of tax offices, a bit like the kind of tax office equivalent of the Panama Papers, to pursue big international fraud networks. So I think you probably have to look at different nations for case studies. I mean, at one point I was going to make the laundering.
Yeah, there are no shortage of ideas. So you mentioned TI. I left investment banking to do this kind of thing at RUSI. There are no shortage of ideas. I think back to the theme, I would say, of a number of our comments is What we need is the political will to engage with those ideas, to take those ideas forward, and actually to deliver on them and to invest in them. And the Foreign Secretary said they can't influence law enforcement. Well, they can influence law enforcement. They can fund them properly. Yeah, and I think that's something which remains.
But do you see it's just so much easier if you say, here's a document, this is what you need to do. So for people like us who are not experts, we need something to recommend. And you're saying there's a bit here, a bit there, a bit there. It'd be great if there was something somewhere that we could say, this is what you need to do.
Very happy to put one together.
Please do. Well, can we do that for written evidence?
If you can do it in written evidence, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, please do. Let's talk afterwards.
There might be better people to do it. But.
You are the man. Thank you. Done.
Ian, you were going to...
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about the possibility of a UK Magnitsky Act. Which would obviously name human rights violators publicly and freeze their assets and ban them from coming to the UK in the same way as the sort of US legislation on this. In response to those of us who've been pushing for this, the government have argued that they can already, that these powers already exist, that that the law enforcement agencies can do this already. Do you think that's true? How should these people be identified? Should there be a public list in the way that there is in the States? How could that be sort of policed and reviewed publicly? I don't know who'd like to sort of...
I mean, I could talk briefly to that. I think a Magnitsky list in the UK would be extremely effective. We know from the United States, where it was introduced in 2012, that it infuriates Vladimir Putin, and he responded asymmetrically by banning American adoption of Russian orphans. It's exactly. I mean, it
is unbelievable. I mean, actually, it's the measure of the man when you think about it. That he would, and it's sick Russian orphans. I mean, he's preventing ill children from leaving the country to get medical treatment abroad. I mean, it's unbelievable, actually.
I mean, what happened subsequently?
I mean, it's a personification of evil.
Yeah, I mean, what happened subsequently was like something out of Gogol. Sergei Magnitsky, who was dead, was put on trial in an empty cage. He was the first dead person to be convicted in the Russian Federation. So it seriously annoys him, and therefore I think would be a very effective measure. I think it would have to be public, and I think it could be a template not just for the Russian Federation but for human rights abusers everywhere. I mean, I think you have to have a named list. You have to give a reason, as the US has done, for why you're including someone on the list. But I think it would be a deterrent, and also a message to the Russian elite that, in a way, they have to choose. It's this old dilemma between actually wanting to live the lifestyle of members of the international super elite while being patriots and nationalists at home. And you can't have it both ways if you're going to support a regime with an egregious human rights record.
Would you have a joint list, an international list so take the US list as a basis, develop it, share it?
Yeah.
So Canada, Australia, the UK.
I mean, I think the more it can be done in connection with the allies who recently expelled diplomats over the Skripal case, the better. I mean, Putin hates multilateralism. He prefers to do sort of sleazy bilateral deals with weaker sovereign nations. So any kind of institutional collective solidarity, I think, would be very helpful.
Can I ask Anne to come in? You were going to come in on a similar sort of area.
Coats off, because I notice everybody around here taking their coats off. And it's very warm in this room. Would you like to take your coats off?
We're okay, I think.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your tremendous investigative journalism. It was really impressive. And I'm just sorry there isn't more of it.
We're doing our best.
And do you feel constrained now because of your papers or whoever you're working for don't give you that time to carry out these kind of investigations, which takes time and a lot of application? Do you feel frustrated?
No, I feel exhilarated. I mean, I'll just say very briefly, I think we're in a kind of golden age for investigative journalism, and we have all these vast data leaks. The problem is that they take time, they take resourcing, they take man and woman power, and we also face kind of being browbeaten by lawyers working for some pretty unscrupulous and ruthless people. So no, I would say actually that we are pretty buoyed by the interest that you, your committee and others show. And that there's now a kind of cross-party consensus that things have reached a stage where we actually have to do something. And that was not the case a couple of years ago when we thought we were publishing into a void. And now we think we have a kind of friendly and receptive audience, and that's great.
We were given a year, 2 full-time people to work on the Paradise Papers. We needed it. I had to read the VAT tax code from beginning to end. Because you're doing quite often the work of a forensic accountant. You're trying to work out how tax was avoided or evaded, how the structure worked. And these things take time, but we do get the resource because I guess they have impact.
Can I ask you, Luke, about your book, which I haven't read? The title's intriguing. Collusion, How Russia Helped Trump Win the White House. Now, given the interest at the moment and the possible effects of Russian influence, both in the United States and in this country as well, could you just reflect on that a moment?
Well, I would just say very briefly that the question I asked in my book, which I think is one that everybody has been puzzling over, is why Donald Trump is so nice about Vladimir Putin when he's so rude about everybody, including the Mayor of London, Theresa May from time to time, the UK, and he seems in some way kind of beholden. And I think clearly we have to wait for further indictments from Robert Mueller, the special counsel who's investigating it. But my view is that there has been an on-off attempt to cultivate Donald Trump by both Soviet Moscow and its sort of Russian successors, stretching back at least 30 years into a trip Trump made in 1987, where he was brought over by the Soviet government on all expenses paid. A jaunt, and I think the connections are financial. I think there was a serious and multi-layered espionage operation, some of which we know about in 2016, certainly involving hacking by the FSB, by the GRU, by Russian military intelligence. And the goal was to discredit Hillary Clinton, who Russia actually thought was going to win, and to push Donald Trump across the line. And I talked to Mike Hayden, who is no Guardian reader. He's the former head of the NSA and CIA, and he said that this was, in his view, the greatest espionage operation in history. It was a mixture of opportunism and KGB playbook, but I think it worked, and I think it has extremely troubling implications for not just for US democracy, but for all democracy, including our democracy, because you can guarantee that the corollary of that for Putin and the people around him is not to stop because he was caught or semi-caught, but to continue and to try and subvert our electoral processes and our politicians and what's done in this House.
Chris, you want to come in quickly?
Yeah, just about interference in political systems. I just wonder what your perception is of Russia's attempt to intervene either through the ambassador or other means in Parliament, in the British electoral system. Is that a real thing that we should be worried about, or is... Oliver?
Well, I'll just say, I'm always slightly sort of teetering on the brink of saying that though Russia is an issue, that all the former Soviet countries have the same, apart from the Baltic states, have the same issues, and the money from all of them is tainted in the same way. And there were a couple of examples I wanted to mention of MPs who've done particularly egregious things with people from former Soviet countries. Liam Fox received £5,700 for the Azeri translation rights of his book, plus more than $3,500 to fly over to attend the launch. I did do the sums, looking at the cover price of the book, the print run of the book. There is no conceivable way that was a commercial proposition.
Can you be very careful with what you say? You do enjoy parliamentary privilege, but use it extremely cautiously and only factually.
I'm very happy to give you the numbers.
So long as you're factual.
There was the print run of the book was 1,000 copies. The retail price was $8, which at the time was about £5. 5 times 1,000 is 5,000. If they received every pound that went for the sales of that book in Azerbaijan, they could only have made £5,000. His advance was £5,700. There may be an issue here that I'm not understanding, but in a Caesar's wife situation, that is problematic. The second example, John Whittingdale accepted £3,000 to fly to Vienna. I do not know how you spend £3,000 to fly to Vienna, from a Ukrainian oligarch's foundation at the time when he was battling extradition to the United States on an FBI indictment.
Is this first, actually?
Yes. That is, on a Caesar's wife situation, that does not look good. And I do think that there is an issue if you are expecting estate agents and solicitors and bankers and others not to accept this money. If members of this House are accepting money from these people, then I think it doesn't look good. And I think that that is something that maybe could be addressed. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Are we talking about just members of the House of Commons, or are we talking about members of the House of Lords as well?
I could also get...
Can I, sorry, forgive me, I'm going to stop individual accusations. I appreciate you're just listing facts, and I appreciate these are public facts. But the implications can be construed in a different way.
Understood.
And if you wish to submit written evidence of it on those sort of issues, then we can consider that separately. And I'd be very grateful if you did, rather than...
I would like to briefly point out, Tom, I meant no party political intention.
No, indeed.
I could have mentioned people from other parties. There were just people who happened to be ministers recently, and therefore inevitably they came from a certain party. That was not in any way a diss on the Conservative Party.
I'm not particularly bothered as to which political party you're... These are individuals who do not have an ability to reply in this forum, and therefore I don't think it's fair to list them in this forum. That's what I'm concerned about. If you wish to submit written evidence, then we can ask them for written evidence in response, and we can or cannot accept evidence as we choose. But I'm just very uncomfortable with naming individuals who can't reply.
Can I just ask on that point? Because it is, I absolutely see what you're trying to do, Tom, and I think it is the right thing to do, to be fair to these individuals. If all I'm saying is that I don't think we should be seen to be saying, "Oh, you can't say this about these individuals or those individuals." So if Oliver has this information, I'd say he should put it all down, all these individuals,
exactly,
and
in writing.
That can be taken as public evidence,
exactly,
and people then can get responses. But he's got these names, then let's get them in the public domain with the right of response.
And that's all I'm saying. If you submit it in writing, then they have the ability to respond on an equal basis. At the moment, they don't have the ability to respond on an equal basis, and therefore it's not fair. No matter whether they were ministers, no matter whether they're Conservative or Labour or SNP or any other party, it's unfair.
To put into the public domain.
I was actually asking a slightly different question, if that's all right. So, which is that there have been, some have argued that, well, for instance, the Prime Minister said yesterday in the liaison committee that she had not seen any successful attempts at undermining the British electoral or political system by the Russians. I presume that the use of the word successful is an important one in that. Do you think that there have been other attempts, whether targeted at individual politicians or at the wider political world through social media and stuff? Do you believe that that is important, significant, or irrelevant?
I think it's important. I think it's extremely hard to determine or make any kind of empirical finding as to whether influencers work, but I just know from my Twitter feed every morning that there are a huge number of Russian trolls who are still active in British informational space that have certain positions, which I think we all understand, and the wider strategy is to kind of push, I would say, the far left and the far right, and certainly that happened in my view before the Brexit vote, and I think it's ongoing, and we see it all across Europe as well. So it's something we should be very vigilant about, because the troll factory that famously was involved in trying to kind of influence Americans in 2016 is still there, it's still going, and I see it every day.
It's now a good time to raise the issue of agents of influence, and to ask that question now, looking at the role of either facilitators or agents of influence, so people who do the Kremlin's bidding. I'm not talking about people who necessarily take modest amounts of money, if they do or not, but the people who benefit either financially, so the city, high-end property companies, but also people, maybe in this house, maybe who you consider elsewhere, who are public figures, or indeed private figures, who do the bidding of the Kremlin, or more importantly here, their proxies. So do you want to give us any indications of how bad you think that is in the UK, or how good, and what sort of effect it has on the public debate? I don't know who to start with that.
Well, for example, the big four accountancy firms, if you go to the blue chip end of the spectrum, make a lot of money. Ernst & Young, for example, when we were looking at the Isle of Man when we were looking at the Isle of Man jet scheme, they were not only providing the tax advice, which allowed them to avoid the VAT, they had clear sight of who was importing jets. Those clients included Dmitry and Arkady Rotenberg, who ended up on a sanctions list with their planes grounded. So we saw memos from PwC. You want me to name?
You name names if you want. I think you should.
I mean, just on PwC.
Deloitte.
Yeah, PwC were the ones who audited the accounts of the firm used by Sergei Voldugin in the Panama Papers, Vladimir Putin's best friend, to process about $2 billion, and they signed off on these accounts.
So that's two. What are the other two? One or two?
Sorry.
What are you? Pricewaterhouse.
Yeah, Pricewaterhouse, Ernst & Young, Deloitte. You know, certainly we've seen them.
And are you saying that these people, just looking at the accountants before you go into other areas, are you saying that these people are knowingly helping people on sanctions lists to pay less tax, or they're knowingly helping people on the sanctions list get around their sort of sanctions status?
No, actually, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that they service clients who end up on sanctions lists, for example, as in the case of the Rotenbergs, and don't do very much about it. So what happened with the Rotenberg checks was that the sanctions officer on the Isle of Man, we can see this in the email correspondence, was asked, should we close these companies down? And the sanctions officer said that would really, no immediate need to do that. The truth is, if they closed the companies down, they would have had to issue VAT refunds to the Rotenbergs, which would have been a very weird thing to do. And so what happened was the jets were grounded, and 1-2 years later they were sold. So those assets were monetized somehow.
Are you saying that those corporate entities, the big accountancy firms, are behaving either illegally, which it doesn't sound like you're saying, but you're saying that they are behaving unethically and against the broader interest of the British national interest?
Yes, the latter. Absolutely.
You're saying yes to that?
Yeah.
That they are behaving unethically and against the interest of the British state?
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you want to go on to other agents of influence? And anyone else, please contribute.
I mean, in terms of unethical behaviour, we found, for example, in Panama Papers, we found numerous very decent-looking law firms with you look on their website and they have a stucco Georgian house and a topiary tree, and we will look after your wealth, etc., etc. And I just give you one small example. We found a company next to Buckingham Palace that set up a offshore company for the daughters of the president of Azerbaijan via Mossack Fonseca, the Panamanian firm, and they were asked whether these people were politically exposed people, and they said no. Which was, what's the word in this place? Untrue. Let's say it's untrue. It was untrue, and we got in touch with them and said, look, we've seen these documents. They refused to comment. We referred the matter to the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and of course they're still in business. And they're still setting up, I imagine, I've got no proof of this, but they're still setting up similar companies. Similar.
And what are the names here?
It's called Child and Child.
Spell that?
Child and Child, yeah. And they may have a perfectly decent explanation, but over 2 years they've yet to offer it. And that's just one example. I mean, in a way it's unfair to pick on them, but because it's the daughters of a very famous kleptocrat, it seems particularly outrageous.
It's almost too easy, that time.
It's too easy, but there are many firms like this, including in the Isle of Man, where, as Juliet was saying before, we see a lot of Russian oligarchs using Isle of Man incorporation companies to, including actually the wife of Dmitry Peskov, who's Vladimir Putin's press guy, also setting up offshore companies via the Isle of Man.
And what about agents of influence in the political world? What sort of people are you looking at there, either on the hard left or the hard right, or the right or left or right?
I mean, I don't know, I've got my fingers burnt and then...
This is a very delicate question.
If you look, please, the reason I'm being cautious about this is because it's simply unfair to conduct this as a kangaroo court. This is not a court. This is an inquiry into Russian corrupt influence in the United Kingdom. If there is a specific person you wish to name, if there is somebody you think that you really do need to name because it is important for the public record, there are ways of doing it, and the way to do it is to do it in writing so we can give them the ability to respond. To use this as a court session in that way would be deeply unfair, and I think a form of abuse of privilege. So I'd be grateful if you used it, therefore, with great moderation.
I just wanted to clarify that the privilege in regards to written evidence is exactly the same as in oral evidence and proceeding in Parliament. The only difference is that we get to decide whether we're going to publish it.
Exactly right. Sorry, I should have clarified that. So you enjoy the same protection. It's exactly as though you gave evidence orally. It just gives the other person the same protection as they respond, which they don't currently have because they're not sitting next to you.
Well, in that case, I think it might be worth mentioning that there are a number of law firms based here that are also working for Russian individuals, often in order to make sure that keep their names out of the papers. I don't particularly want to paint a giant target on my forehead, so I'm not actually going to say who they are. But
the individuals or the law companies?
Actually, either.
I think we've exhausted the line of questioning on naming names, if you don't mind, unless you wish to. And as I say, you enjoy exactly the same privilege, and indeed anybody watching these proceedings enjoys the same privilege if they submit evidence and we accept it. The "and we accept it" bit is the essential bit. Just because you've submitted evidence does not mean you enjoy privilege. We must accept it before you enjoy privilege. And then we can ask whoever it is you may have cited as to whether or not they wish to respond, and they can enjoy the same privilege in response. Anne, you wanted to come in with something else.
I meet quite a number of human rights defenders, both in Russia and ones who come to this country. And obviously they name people who have access to this country and they consider to be perpetrators or, against human rights defenders. How do you think we should be dealing with them?
With sort of human rights defenders?
Defenders, yes.
Well, first of all, we can give them visas. These are the kind of people
they name.
Yeah.
You know, they are trying to work in Russia. They work in Russia as human rights defenders. It's a very difficult thing to do, as you know. And then they come to this country to give us evidence every so often. And sometimes they name people who have, freedom to come to this country and go back home without anybody batting an eyelid.
Tell us. We'll investigate. Tell us. Give us the names. We'll investigate them.
I'll do that. It seems that if you are tempted to go ahead with a Magnitsky list type idea, I hope, and if you do, that would not be confined only to Russians. It would also be a broader. I think
no, it would have to be international.
I think it would be counterproductive if it were targeted only at one citizenship. I think that human rights defenders are precisely the kind of people you should be trying to harvest, as it were, data from. I think people who are reliable human rights defenders who have with a track record of good work have got very valuable points to make. Though I think it's important not to become too closely associated with them, because that can also be harmful.
But this is effectively this says that there is a clear role for the Foreign Office in collecting information overseas, which can then be used by law enforcement agencies, and therefore the Magnitsky Acts that we are talking about are not simply law enforcement tools, but are policy tools of Her Majesty's government in all its forms. Correct?
I certainly think that's how the United States goes about it. I think the State Department is involved, isn't it?
Yeah, and I just think the big point here is that we have to be very clear all the time when we talk about Russia. There's a distinction between Putin and the 5,000 people around him and the Russian people who are very much the kind of victims in the situation and deserve better, because probably all of us appearing here this afternoon would be accused of being Russophobic, and I think certainly I can speak for Oliver and I. We both live in Russia. We love Russia. We are pro-Russian, which is not the same as supporting the regime.
I think it's worth being clear that the main victims of the Putin regime are the Russian people, who have lost at least $300 billion equivalent and many, many years of investment that could have gone into happier and better lives, but instead has seen a falling life expectancy and a level of corruption that sadly has led to many incidents, not least, of course, the recent shopping fire that has killed so many so tragically.
Can I ask you what's your views of Russia Today and Sputnik?
Of
Russia Today and Sputnik.
I would just say briefly, I would urge anyone from this place to not appear on Russia Today, because it legitimizes their claim that they are a regular broadcaster, no different from the BBC, CNN or Al Jazeera, even though it's unwatchable. But don't go on it. I think the best thing to do with Russia Today is just to ignore it, because I think its role is exaggerated. I don't think it's worth closing it down as a future diplomatic measure. And I mean, it is unwatchable.
But I think there there were fears raised when there was a real threat that Russia Today might be closed down in retaliation for Salisbury, that European media would find all their foreign correspondents chucked out of Russia. I imagine that was a short-term threat, because I think Putin's regime thrives on the publicity that it gets and enjoys it. So I'm not sure that the news blackout would have been sustained very long by Russia.
Ian, you wanted to come in?
Just on this issue of media, can I just ask your opinion on why you think Sputnik opened an office in Edinburgh in 2014?
Well, my opinion is because I think, without sounding too kind of conspiratorial, that certainly the Kremlin would be in favour of Scottish independence. Anything which makes the UK weaker is a goal for the Kremlin, and I think it was a kind of manoeuvre in anticipation of that, whether perhaps it won't happen, perhaps it will happen 5, 10, 15 years, to build a kind of footprint there and to kind of locate. I mean, it's a sort of classic soft power manoeuvre of the kind that actually Russia's been doing all over Europe, and we've seen a big rollout in the last 10 years of Russia Today and Sputnik. Started off in English, it's now in Arabic, Spanish, German, French, everywhere. So the media information sort of strategy overall is not to provide glowing stories about how wonderful Russia is, but to essentially be a kind of faux left-wing, anti-mainstream channel that pumps out 1,000 conspiracy theories of the kind that we've seen this week in Sergei Skripal. So I think it's ominous, but I don't think it's very ominous, but it's certainly worth something. It's certainly worth watching and tracking.
Can I just briefly propose a possible second alternative? I'm quite keen to try and avoid ascribing to menace what can be ascribed to incompetence. It may well be, knowing how Russian state agencies work, that an employee at Russia Today or Sputnik had, a son or a daughter at Edinburgh University and wanted to get them a really nice flat, maybe in the old town. I wouldn't, I mean, if you look at, for example, where the Radio Moscow flat is, it's right next to sort of the London Library. I think that says more about where someone wants to have their office than the fact that this is a radio station no one listens to. That's just
So it's just petty corruption rather than organised corruption.
I think the two are natural bedfellows.
Very quickly talk about this concept of soft power. Soft power in the West, Joseph Nye, power of attraction. This is soft power in the terms of information, but for a divisive and aggressive manipulatory end. So it's a sort of warfare without the war. They want to split up the United Kingdom, and they're using informational warfare to do it, in the same way that during the Senate Intelligence Committees, they found Russian trolls were trying to organise pro- and anti-Muslim demonstrations in the same town, in the same time in Texas, a place with very high gun ownership rates, in order to spark violence. So this is soft power, admittedly, in the sense it's non-lethal, but it's potentially having a very aggressive and potentially a lethal outcome.
I would completely agree with that, and I think there's been a concerted attempt, both in the US and Europe, to exploit what I would say are sort of pre-existing divisions, social divisions in this country and elsewhere, on the left and the right. I mean, Putin didn't create these divisions, but certainly post-2008, where there's been a revolt, populist revolt against the establishment, if you like, and unhappiness with austerity, to kind of surf on that, actually in a very opportunistic way. And it's coupled with something which I do think is quite sinister, which is to basically to export a form of nihilism and to say there is no truth, actually, that critical thinking doesn't exist, that there are various conspiracy theories, that politicians everywhere, including in this place, are venal, corruptible, greedy, unprincipled, and once you establish a kind of a playing field of universal cynicism, then Russia can do its kind of sovereign thing, unnoticed and unchallenged. And this may sound a little bit hyperbolic, but I think to some degree it's a kind of war for the mind. Actually, it's a war for how people think, and it's an attack on the idea of empirical thinking and reason.
And some form of truth.
And some form of truth. And I think it's very dangerous. And I think people need to recognize. I mean, Putin styles himself as a kind of master of psychology. And you look at the Skripal case, and on a rational level, it makes no sense at all. But on a level of spreading fear, both internationally and inside the Russian elite, it was a very effective measure.
This is the last question.
But, I mean, given that Russia today, owned, funded, set up by the Kremlin, I mean, it's a Putin propaganda channel. Why are you so relaxed? Why are you more relaxed about that? I mean, why shouldn't we close this down? Why should we stand for this sort of spurious idea that it's somehow a legitimate broadcaster on a par with the BBC? And why should British politicians be allowed to take? Be allowed to take money from it?
I don't think we should be complacent, but the thing about Russia today is it's kind of blatant. It's out there, and it's part of this sort of this strategy.
Yeah, but that's easy. With respect, that's easy for you as a sort of media professional, author, to say. But I'm afraid young people in Britain who don't buy newspapers and don't read serious books on this, how do they choose and judge between what's reputable and trustworthy and what isn't? And I've got to say to you, I mean, I'm on the receiving end of all this stuff on Twitter all the time, constantly being told that the BBC can't be trusted and people should watch Russia Today instead. So, I don't think we should be as relaxed about this.
Well, I'm not relaxed at all, but I think it's the kind of insidious and invisible use of social media and Facebook and fake accounts. I mean, I'd be interested to know how many of the people trolling you are actually real people and how many are actually sitting in St. Petersburg, actually called Sergei, but pretending to be Andrew.
Does anybody on the panel think that RT should not be allowed to operate in Britain as a legitimate broadcaster?
I think that it's important to preserve what we're good at, which is we're an open place with freedom of media. I mean, but I do think you're making a very good point, which is, and it actually ties back to the beginning about Russian finance here, which is that Russia has consistently exploited the fact that our principles are for free economy, free media space, and so on, by exploiting that, by essentially dishonourably sending things here which shouldn't be here. And that is a difficult question, and how we deal with that. I personally think that the retaliation that would come from us losing a BBC presence in Russia, if that were to be the response, would be way worse than what would happen if we were to close RT here. I agree with Luke. I think RT is a marginal broadcast.
I mean, I was myself thrown out of Russia in 2011, and I know. And this is not to say we shouldn't do it, but this is what would happen. Every British correspondent would be expelled were RT to be closed. So there is a calculus there, which is not to say you're wrong, because you're right.
There is a precedent, though. Ofcom took the licence of the Iranian state propaganda channel Press TV away. Some of the same people who appear on RT used to appear on Press TV. The fact is that was done because it breached clearly Ofcom's regulations. There were 14 occasions, as far as I'm aware, that RT was also in breach of Ofcom's regulations. That's what our select committee found a year ago. Isn't there an argument that Ofcom should be more rigorous with RT?
I think Ofcom has to call it. And if they do decide to shut RT, then we just have to welcome home our returning colleagues from Moscow, but they will be expelled.
Very last one, Bob.
There is an alternative to this, and I think it's one that we should be looking at, is I think last week the Congress began the Countering Propaganda Bill that requires state broadcasters who do not have an independent editorial line to effectively carry a health warning. Is anybody out of the four, very briefly, sympathetic to a countering propaganda bill requiring authoritarian broadcasters to carry some kind of health warning?
I'm not really in favour of governments telling television channels what they should write on their screens. And I do think it's slightly ironic of that coming from America, considering how wildly disparate the various television channels that they have in their country. I think that the free media should be celebrated and journalists should be paid.
Even when it's not free, even when it's there as a tool of warfare.
I think we could go on for a number of hours on this, and I'm extremely grateful to our witnesses. As I say, if you do have evidence that you wish to submit in writing, you will enjoy privilege, as will anybody else whose evidence is accepted. Then the key is accepted. If you submit it and you choose to publish it and it has not been accepted, you do not enjoy privilege. Let me be quite clear about that. Oral evidence has already been accepted because it's oral evidence, but written evidence that is not accepted does not enjoy privilege.
So if I'm tweeting an accountancy firms,
so we'll... Bob. Yeah, it's accepted. Accepted for publication, that's what I mean.
Yes. It's not whether it's accepted. We can't not accept it. We can choose not to publish.
So write in.
So write in.
And just by the way, tweeting from the chamber or tweeting from the committee does not enjoy privilege. Right. No.
Well, Chair, Chris's point seems to me an important. What's the point you're making about?
It's a very simple one, which is basically that proceeding in Parliament under the Bill of Rights shall not be questioned or impeached in any court of law or any other place. It's been around for a very long time, and that carries a requirement of fair process with it, and of fairness. You can't just say anything, and you can't also inaccurately report what has happened in a proceeding in Parliament. So as long as something is an accurate representation.
Can I suggest that if people are questioning what the procedure is specifically, they go to a lawyer and read standing orders where this is covered in detail. But I'm just warning you that privilege is not automatic. That's what I'm saying. So, okay, in written. Right. Order. We're going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go back into formal session, and we have two new witnesses, and I'm very grateful you've both come, Mr. Ashrafkov and Mr. Borisovich. Thank you very much indeed for being here. I was going to start off, if I may, Mr. Ashrafkov, your former, in 2016 you told our predecessor committee that the Anti-Corruption Foundation has been bringing cases of Russian-related corruption in the UK to the attention of the Serious Fraud Office and financial regulators, but that your words had fallen on deaf ears. Is that still the case?
That's correct.
It is still applying, that your words are still valid on that?
We have brought the most recent submission has been about a month ago on the case of Mr. Deripaska. We haven't heard back, but it can still happen.
And you said you said to the predecessor committee that those offices, the serious fraud offices, were understaffed and under-resourced. Do you still believe that to be the case?
Yes, I think there is several reasons why serious fraud office, other regulators in Britain turn a blind eye towards Russian corrupt money flows. One is they don't have enough resources, monetary, staffing, etc. There's also perceived need to get evidence from Russia if they investigated a particular case of corruption, which may not be true. And there is no real political will to go after corrupt money flows. Maybe it will change in the current political situation. They can expect that the billionaires whom they will investigate will hire the best legal help available. Would SFO want to compete with the best lawyers? So I think on the balance they decide it's not very economical to pursue such cases.
Bridget, you want to come in quickly?
Yes, just quickly. Do you think that, judging from what you're saying, you think that's intentional and deliberate, that they are deliberately turning a blind eye and using resources perhaps as a sort of cover and the smokescreen not to do this? But what, in your sense, is the sort of long-term wide implications of this?
Well, it's true that over the last years, probably decades, Britain has become a safe haven for corrupt money, to a certain degree coming from Russia. And I hope this situation will change in the current political climate.
Royston, you wanted to come in.
How is the money of individuals connected to the Kremlin in the UK used to support the regime in Moscow?
Well, there are a number of ways how the oligarchs and kleptocrats are linked to Putin regime. In some cases, they act as frontmen for people, maybe for Putin himself, for his cronies in the political administration of Russia. In some cases, they're used as go-between between Western elites, political business elites. The case of Mr. Deripaska, which was recently uncovered, who entertained a prominent Russian government official on his yacht off the shores of Norway, and there is video footage of them discussing Trump's campaign and Russia-US relations. And we know that Mr. Deripaska has used services of Paul Manafort, who was one of the key members of Trump's campaign when he was running for president. So that's one of the connections.
Mr. Borisovich, do you want to add something to that?
Well, yes, I guess in various ways that by far not everything is visible. So the best people to answer that would be MI6. And in terms of visible evidence, you have to look at Russia, where all these oligarchs, they have their chores. I'm not sure how they defined and how they determined, but either building an Olympic construction site, like Deripaska was built the international airport in Sochi for the Olympics, or constructing new football stadiums for the upcoming World Cup. Anyway, infrastructure projects they're being tasked with all different infrastructure projects, with all different rural revitalization projects. They're used by Kremlin as their purses.
So if those oligarchs come under pressure in the UK, what effect would that have on President Putin and the regime?
Total and absolute, because you have to understand, Russia is absolute kleptocracy. What that means is that political elite is plundering the country, robbing their fellow taxpayers blind. But the money doesn't stay in Russia. It comes out immediately as soon as it's stolen. It comes out, and after a quick spin in the laundromat of British offshore territories, it comes right here. And it doesn't sit under the palm tree in Cayman Islands. It is invested in stocks and shares and bonds and properties and yachts and planes, in reputation laundering. But it all comes here. So cutting that link that allows the elite to export their loot, killing the laundromat is how you fight the regime. There is no other way.
So, with the Anti-Corruption Foundation, how difficult is it to prove that money brought into the UK through banks or property market is associated with corruption or illegal activity? I mean, I know we've sort of talked about it broadly, but how do we prove that?
Look, I mean, first of all, a lot of this is under a statute of regulations. But then you have to look at the Russian oligarchs as a class, right? And no matter how different they seem to you, one owns a football club, another donated money to Oxford for a school of government, another one sat in Russian jail for 6 years under communism, and the next one has been a civil servant. All of them have very particular things in common. All of them can be measured with the same yardstick. Basically, three things. they're not self-made businessmen in the American sort of sense. Every one of them made money through a relationship with the Russian government. They either bought something for pennies that was worth billions, or sold something for fortunes to the Russian government. The smartest one did both, first bought, then sold. And some of them, the unique ones, were always civil servants working for dozens of years for Russian government, state-run companies, and as a result managed to get miraculously rich. All of them derived their riches from their relationship with Russian government. Second thing in common is that while in this process, all of them committed acts that in our country would be criminal. And the only reason they got away with that is because either mafia or the government, or sometimes it's the same thing in Russia, covered it up and allowed them to continue with their riches, which creates the third common thing. It's the bond they all have with the Russian government that grows from how they made their money and carries on now. And the bond that forces them to do all sorts of chores for Putin, whether hidden, whether visible or invisible, whether it's donating $7 million to the GOP in the year of the presidential election in the States, or supporting an anti-EU think tank in Germany. They all do something, it's just, we don't see most of that. That's the tip of the iceberg that we see. Now, if you want me to give you some examples, I'm very happy to, about talking about people who live among us. For example, the Arsenal part owner, Mr. Usmanov. Let's take him, for example. Now, his riches are coming from the time when he was working for Gazprom, for its investment arm, Gazprom Invest. Now, at that time, he was buying, on behalf of the Russian government, the Russian government's company, stakes in metallurgical plants in Russia. Then, while still being an officer, the investment officer in Gazprom, he swapped them for 63 gas stations that he bought on the side in his own company here in the UK, and swapped them as an asset swap. Basically, his own entity ended up with these undervalued metallurgical plants. And Russia, Gazprom got 63 stagnant gas stations. Now, obviously, the metallurgical stakes made him a billionaire immediately. They expanded in value, and now this is all about the dealings with the government and how this would be perceived corrupt in this country. Now, for the cover-up and the bond. All this is being done while and under the watchful eye of the chairman of Gazprom at the time, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. No wonder that Mr. Usmanov and Medvedev have a very close relationship. No wonder that they go through life supporting each other. No wonder that Mr. Usmanov recently has been, again, by our colleagues in Anti-Corruption Foundation, found out, given a bribe to Mr. Medvedev in a form of a land plot in the prime Moscow suburb. So this is all, this is one example. This is how this is, and this is true for pretty much every Russian oligarch.
If I may add, there has been some estimates of money coming from Russia to Britain over the last 20 years, and it's probably 100 billion is a good number, but most of that money is legitimate. I think only a fraction of that is proceeds of corruption and crime. And I believe Britain has existing legislation, the Bribery Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the recently introduced unexplained wealth orders, that if there is political will to apply it in a consistent manner, would go a long way towards targeting and rooting out corruption. But I would not, of course, advocate some blanket bans or restriction of rights similar to what the American administration has done with their list, which just cut and paste the Forbes list of the top Russian businessmen.
So, sorry, just as tiny. You said it's only a small fraction that you think is corrupt. How small?
It's difficult to estimate. Of course, people try to keep hush-hush about this, especially about the corrupt money. I think it's in the order of billions, maybe tens of billions.
Thank you.
Pretty, you wanted to come in?
Yes. organised serious crime, money laundering, and some of the issues we've been discussing so far, obviously have national security implications for Britain, for the United Kingdom government. Do you have any sense whatsoever as to how effective the UK intelligence services are in terms of following the money of Mr. Putin and his associates in the United Kingdom?
We can only judge from public sources, and there is anecdotal evidence that there's a lot of proceeds of corruption that's parked in London property, that's parked in UK financial institutions, but we haven't seen any prominent public case of UK regulators, the SFO, the financial regulators, going after a particular case.
Do you think that's because that regulatory landscape it's piecemeal, it's fragmented? Do you think it could be more coherent?
There are several factors. Of course, there is lobbying of enablers of kleptocrats, the unscrupulous bankers, lawyers, property state agents that get rich from servicing this dirty money flow. There's also, as I said, SFO probably thinks it's uneconomical to expend resources on pursuing somebody like Mr. Deripaska, who will hire the best lawyers, and it will be a long and dragged out procedure, including court.
You mentioned lobbying. Do you think that lobbying goes to high levels in government? And are they using other influences as well to get to key decision makers?
Probably yes. I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theories. I think the British political system is quite resilient, and I wouldn't blame a politician if he accepts in a transparent manner £5,000 from a Russian company or Azeri company, as was mentioned here, that it necessarily influence his decision making. But I think there are more sort of hidden ways of lobbyists affecting the decisions and affecting the outcomes of legislative process or the government process.
What are those?
I think we can judge from the results and their absence. The corrupt money is being parked in London, in property, and not much being done. We always see is, newspaper articles.
So inertia in this system is an example of A, inertia in the system, or B, a reluctance to take this seriously, or C, part because of the influence, soft corruption, hard corruption, to prevent the system becoming more resilient and tougher. Which do you think out of those three options is it?
Well, Britain has built itself on being an open economy and open to investment, finance professionals from all over the world. And I think there is a case to be made that money brought into Britain brings employment, investment, but at the same time, if you consider the overall cost, is in case of Russia, every month we hear that Royal Air Force is scrambling jets to intercept Russian bombers. And Putin's regime is emboldened in its external aggressiveness. I'm talking about conflict in Ukraine. I'm talking about potential role of Russian authorities in Skripal assassination, because they have this system of economic and political corruption at home. And some of prominent Russian business people with connection to UK are enablers of this regime.
Can I just ask, is there an argument to be made then that, from your earlier points, that effectively some dirty money is here and we've just got to accept it, but actually we should be building the wall for future rather than for the past?
I think some people and some transactions have to be investigated in the context of existing legislation. There is some legislation that has been introduced, like Magnitsky Act, like the opening of property registers, that people wouldn't be able to hide behind shell companies. I think that this has to be done. This as well will be very beneficial in rooting out corruption. There's also a case to be made to have something similar to what in US they do, list sanctions. list of small number of people who are barred from interacting with US persons in the US case and with the UK companies and people in Britain's case.
If I may add, I think that Magnitsky Act is or Magnitsky type legislation is exactly a piece of legislation that allows to look back on crimes that were committed or corruption that occurred in the past. Because this is not a reason for criminal prosecution, rather the arrest of assets and the rejection of visa application or leave to remain. Any of that can be done on the basis of discovery of acts of corruption or criminal acts in the past. And my suggestion to the committee is to make sure that the Magnitsky Act that is being discussed now doesn't only include human rights abuses, but other criminal behavior like money laundering, like corruption, bribery, maybe support of aggressive political regimes that conduct acts of terrorism on foreign soil.
So Magnitsky Plus. So it's not only the human rights aspect, but actually broader than that.
Well, to some extent you can argue that this is all against human rights, that corruption and bribery, pillaging of Russia abuses Russians' human rights. But why don't you just put it straight and forward in the case that you can arrest somebody's assets if you discover that this is that there's been elements of corruption or money laundering. In fact, this is the only country that makes not reporting money laundering a criminal offense.
This country?
Yes, you are liable for 5 years if you don't report evidence of money laundering, like terrorist activity as well. So why don't include money laundering in a Magnitsky Act?
That is a good point. This argument, of course, implies again the strength of working with others on a Magnitsky Act. So doing, I mean, whether you'd have exactly the same list or not is debatable, but at least having comparable lists between the United States and the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany. I mean, one could go on, but would you agree that the universality of this would help enormously?
Absolutely.
Not only in case of Magnitsky list, but on other anti-corruption measures and countering Russian influence, yes, of course. And we've seen wonderful example of solidarity with the recent expulsion across different countries.
We have, and we've, I must say personally, we've received enormous amount of personal goodwill from our sister committees across Europe and across the world. May I ask one specific question? We've been focusing clearly on the corruption element. Do you feel that this corruption is a threat to the UK's national security? Is this in some way softening up the UK in ways that actually endanger the UK's national security?
I definitely think so, in a number of ways. Of course, corruption permeates Russian security services, and obviously corruption enables sensitive materials, armaments, information, etc. to fall into wrong hands. We don't know exactly what happened in Salisbury, but it's possible that this nerve agent fell into wrong hands through corruption. So that's one issue. Another issue is corruption distorts the market. Let's take VTB, one of the largest Russian state banks. It operates on the international capital markets. It is listed on London Stock Exchange, so investment is open to widows and orphans, and it is one of the most corrupt institutions. And I think in 2012, we brought a case to FSA, then financial regulator, and to Serious Fraud Office with a case of corruption within VTB Bank to the tune of about $150 million US. We haven't heard that any investigation was started. We think that they just let it go.
So can we just check the details? So you reported that to the FSA when?
2012.
And nothing happened?
Nothing happened.
Was any reason given?
I don't think FSA or SFO has the obligation to respond.
I asked the Prime Minister about that yesterday at liaison. She's agreed to write to the committee. So
excellent.
Just to return to the Magnitsky Act that was under discussion a moment ago, how do you think this should be sort of policed? How do you think that it should be? I mean, obviously it would be a public list. How should it be independently assessed each year? How should the government have to report on action that have been taken against the people on the list? Have you got any sort of thoughts on that you could perhaps share with us?
Clearly, I think it should be absolutely public, initiated by the government, and accountable to the parliament.
Should it be independently assessed each year, perhaps?
I don't think there is a need. The parliament overseeing it is enough.
Ask the question that Mr. Seeley asked previously, but in a slightly different way, and perhaps a bit more less diplomatically. So so as I understand it from what everybody said today, there's a general feeling that British governments of different political hues have tended to be rather reluctant to deal with the issue of dirty money in London. I note the nods. You could see various reasons for that. One is that we just think that it would be too financially difficult for our economy. Secondly, that we haven't really noticed that there's a problem, which is kind of carelessness. Or thirdly, that there are individuals or there's a political culture here which simply doesn't really care or has been inveigled into not caring by others.
I'll start and may continue. I think all three of those. First of all, there are of course powerful interests that would not like the situation to change. Let's take one example. Company BP, it owns about 20% of Rosneft, the biggest Russian oil company. Mr. Dudley, the chief executive officer of BP, sits on the board of Rosneft together with Igor Sechin, which is one of the key architects of Putin's architecture of power. It's probably legal, but is this right and ethical? So this is one example. I think the corrupt money flows, although substantial in absolute amount, they are quite tiny compared to the total financial flows that go through British financial system. It's billions, maybe tens of billions, but rooting it out would not have a significant effect on British economy, on its financial system. And I think, yes, until recently, this problem wasn't really recognized as something that requires attention. It's only after the corrupt system built by Putin in Russia enabled him to be more aggressive internationally. Ukraine, these assassinations, meddling in electoral process in the US, in European elections, that this problem came to the attention of British political establishment, and I hope there will be enough momentum that something is done in this respect.
So a version of that might be that sometimes British politicians have been so keen to do more business with Russia that they've wanted to forget the problems and wanted to forget the diplomatic problems, the security problems, all the rest.
That's definitely my impression, yes.
But and from your experience of dealing with Russian or British businesses who've had to do business in Russia, has the Bribery Act made it more difficult for them?
Probably yes, superficially, but that's the irony. From talking to different anti-corruption practitioners in the UK, from our own experience, it seems like Serious Fraud Office would be more interested in prosecuting a British company that's bribing some government official, rather than somebody like Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska that is in corrupt relationship with Russian government. At the same time, Mr. Deripaska owns property in London. He's a majority shareholder of a company that's quoted on London Stock Exchange. He was the chief executive officer of that company. So there's clearly British...
Plus, yeah?
Sorry?
EN Plus?
EN Plus, yes.
Which has a former member of this House as its chairman.
So he clearly has connection to Britain. Bribery Act clearly would have jurisdiction in this case. And within the context of Bribery Act, any gift to a foreign government official, entertaining him on the yacht, there's evidence of using escort services, private jets, etc. This requires prosecution. But I don't expect SFO will take up this case, unfortunately.
And Tier 1 investor visas, which haven't been around for all that long, they've been taken up by a significant number of Russians.
It's true, but I also wouldn't overestimate significance of these visas in the context of corruption. Britain is relatively open economy. It's not hard to get a right to live and work in Britain through work visas, through entrepreneur visas. This is just an easy way for somebody with significant wealth to get this possibility fast. And
that sounds like a contradiction. That makes it seem more of a problem rather than less of a problem. If it's awfully easy to come in here and bribe your way in with £2 million, which is a gnat on the backside of an elephant to some of these people, doesn't that make us very vulnerable?
I think most people who came on these visas come here with legitimate reasons and with legitimate wealth. I think each case should be investigated and prosecuted individually. And if this visa regime didn't exist, they still would be able to come to the UK either on different kind of visas or by getting, Cyprus passport or some other kind of passport and coming to the UK.
So you see Cyprus as an entry point and a problem, potentially?
As well as some other countries, yes.
Just to finish that.
Well, I think in the EU, a number of countries have this regime that when you buy property or you make investments in government bonds, you get either passport or a long-term residence visa, and with a passport you obviously can work in Britain.
People have named various countries. Would you like to name any countries that you feel?
I think Cyprus has been really the destination of choice for many people. Yeah.
Can I ask about the implications for British foreign policy? The reason I'm asking this question is because, of course, this level of corruption that is allowed, this level of laundering that is allowed with corrupt money in the UK must have an effect on Russia itself. It must make corruption easier and more prevalent. And this must in itself undermine Britain's security by seeing an important and valued partner in many different ways over the centuries be ruined by a corrupt cartel of thieves. Is it not therefore directly against Britain's foreign policy interests to support this?
The lack of serious response to that has been evidence over years has completely emboldened Russian kleptocratic elites to the extent that they think they own Britain. That is true. That is anecdotal evidence, but it is the when instead of going after where it hurts kleptocracy, hitting its wallet, Britain sends out 23 diplomats. 123 Russian oligarchs have a party because their assets have been preserved, their influence, their place in the society has not changed, and it is status quo, business as usual. That means that they have legitimate claim to come here and do business. That has to change for the sake of not only the UK, it also for the sake of Russia has to change, and the money laundering should be a foreign policy issue rather than criminal.
Presumably this also weakens important allies of ours like those bordering Russia to the east and undermines their security. It undermines the security of countries like Ukraine. It undermines the security of friendly countries like Georgia. And therefore this money laundering is directly against the foreign policy interests of the United Kingdom.
Absolutely. Well, again, you have a system that is built, kleptocracy system is built on exporting illegal wealth. That system has become aggressive to its neighbors. It's become aggressive not to its neighbors. It's become aggressive at going against, multilateral unilateralism. It is going against democracy. It is undermining democratic processes in the U.S. and the UK and Europe, and it's totally emboldened by the fact that, unlike in the in the time of Cold War and the good old Soviet era, people who are perceived to be new enemies are allowed to access banks and all financial instruments of the West. Their money is hidden somewhere in plain sight, somewhere here, and nothing is being done to them.
So you're saying kicking out 23 diplomats looks good, but in fact, when it comes to deterrence, is irrelevant?
Of course, I think Mr. Putin expected that and probably wanted that to happen, because this is when he go and complain about unfairness, that he's been singled out, that there's been no proof of that. In fact, it would have been a lot more. I mean, the British government at this time has a whole arsenal of weaponry available to it. Unexplained wealth orders, Magnitsky Amendment to Criminal Finances Bill, Magnitsky Act that is being discussed now, which is very easy to pass. It also could revoke the banking licenses of Russian state bank like VTB, who is an embodiment of corruption, or politely ask Russian state-run companies like Gazprom to delist from London Stock Exchange to find themselves new capital market. And
so it's a great irony that what we should actually be doing is supporting the Russian economy, getting Russian money back to Russia so that the Russian economy grows and the kleptocratic system is undermined, and therefore all of our interests are actually one with the Russian people, which is to make Russia great again and to make Putin poor again.
In fact, Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right, because think about this, you cut that link. If the money doesn't go anywhere, if it has to stay in Russia, maybe, well, not now, maybe in a generation, maybe two, but maybe these people will start thinking about the rule of law. Maybe they'll start thinking about property rights. Maybe they start thinking about human rights. Because right now, the system that's based on lawlessness, on racketeering, on stealing from taxpayers, that is totally emboldens them, because the money goes away. The money is kept safe in our own banks.
So, Mr. Borisovich, you would agree, presumably, then, that it is very unusual. In fact, I can think of no examples where human rights have preceded economic rights. But because economic rights are meaningless in Russia, human rights are meaningless. And therefore, actually, in order to promote human rights in Russia, we need to promote economic rights, and that means rejecting dirty money.
I totally agree with you.
So just one thing about that. The other thing that is a major problem for Russia is the brain drain that's going on, because it has a... Yeah.
It's exactly the same, because just as money is coming abroad. Sorry, forgive me.
Yeah, no, well, thank you for agreeing with me. You're quite right.
Sorry, would you care to answer?
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, there has been some criticism of the overall sort of blanket approach that U.S. government has displayed while putting the list for the most recent list for sanctions, basically copying the top 100 of Russian Forbes. I actually think that this is a right approach, that instead of U.S. Treasury being the judge of who is the bad guy, who is a good guy, cutting the ability of the system to export its wealth, its dirty money, in general, would be one way of the most efficient way to fight aggressive Putin's kleptocracy.
So if you seem to be going against targeted sanctions and much more to general financial sanctions. Would that be fair?
Again, think about targeting, but on a broader scale. Target 100 oligarchs close to Putin, not 3. Okay. Target all Russian state-run banks. I mean, they're not only embodiments of corruption, they're a financial support of the system. For some reason, their European branches and foreign subsidiaries were carved out of global EU and US sanctions. Well, it's probably time, at least in Britain, to reverse that decision. Let VTB, Gazprom Bank, and Sber and others go home and stop using it. It is comical, really. It's not even comical. It's sad when Mrs. Prime Minister, addressing you in the Parliament, promises retaliation to Russia for its behavior, for its act of terrorism on British soil. At exactly the same time, Russian gas monopoly, state-run monopoly, launches $750 million bond 2 miles away from this place. And this is sad.
And VTB did a $4 billion euro.
And next 2 days later, VTB
on the 21st of March.
Launches a $4 billion a Eurobond for Russia. Has an interesting clause where payment could be made in rubles, i.e., clearly that's the bond issue that's been marketed to Russian kleptocrats abroad. If something happens to them, to their assets, yet they can get ruble compensation at home. I mean, even to allow that kind of clause to be publicly sold in the UK, I think it's beyond belief.
If I may add,
sorry, Vladimir, you wanted to come in?
Yes, there is no silver bullet, any measure or set of measures that British government or the West in general can undertake to limit Russia's aggressiveness abroad. It's only after Russia has become aggressive that Western governments has started to take notice of the corruption, including British government. The abuse of human rights and corruption has been going on in Russia for the last 20 years. Only when Russia became aggressive, only when it became a matter of foreign policy, did Britain notice it and started considering measures against it. I think that Britain still prides itself on rule of law. I think these sort of extrajudicial sanctions, targeted sanctions, have to be used very sparingly and should be limited. There is existing body of law that should be applied to scrutinizing existing money in the UK, existing property, a number of individuals. But if we go towards specific sanctions that would ban individuals or companies from access to British financial system, this has to be limited, very well researched and well based.
We've covered quite a lot of the Magnitsky Act in conversation already. One of the concerns that I know many of us have is that we do know there are, of course, many Russians in the United Kingdom who are not only welcome but who contribute enormously to the UK in many different ways, whether scientific. In fact, the graphene discoveries at the University of Manchester are huge credits to Anglo-Russian scientific cooperation, and people like that are very, very welcome, and indeed people like yourselves are very welcome as well, as you have been fleeing human rights abuses in your home country. There is a concern that many of us have that some of the legislation that we're talking about could accidentally or lead to a climate in which perfectly innocent, perfectly welcome Russians feel at risk or feel intimidated. Do you think that's a major concern?
UK is a natural magnet for Russians. If they learn any foreign language, it's likely to be English, which comes handy here. London is a large metropolitan city, similar to Moscow. It has a lot to offer in many respects. London is the capital of finance and business. People trust British education system, British court system, so London in any case will be a magnet for Russians for visit, for settlement, etc. I don't think that's going to change, and I think that targeted measures against specific individuals and companies on a limited scale would go a long way towards cleaning up the British financial system, which will make Britain even more attractive for legitimate money and people who are coming to the UK.
Is there such a thing as clean money in Russia today?
I believe so, yes. My firm belief is that most Russian money that came to the UK is not corrupt.
Well, we differ here in opinions, but I believe that there is a difference between clean money and money that is controlled by the regime. Sometimes you have businesses that have legitimate claim on the origin of their of the funds. However, just by the virtue of residing in Russia, they are under the same Putin's jurisdiction. And if you cannot take your assets out of Russia, then you can't do anything. You'll have to do his bidding. That's just the way it is. So by virtue of targeting the broader amount of money, I think the measures will be more efficient to fight the regime.
Well, look, I must say I'm hugely grateful for your time this afternoon. I'm very, very grateful indeed for your evidence as well and your perspective. If there is something you feel you wish to add, do please feel free to write to us. It would be very interesting to hear any further thoughts. Unless there are any other points, I think. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Order.
Committee Room 6, sound. 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 Committee Room 6,